There is something deeply disturbing hidden in the oldest texts about hell. I am not speaking of the medieval images we know, but of preserved records that were, for centuries, kept out of the most repeated versions. Ancient manuscripts contain descriptions that make popular representations seem too soft. Why did so many traditions choose to silence these darker layers? If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, take the opportunity and subscribe now. Warning: this documentary uses AI-generated images for illustrative purposes. Although the visual is synthetic, the content is the fruit of rigorous research based on real historical and scientific sources. Sources in the description. In late copies of the Apocalypse of Peter, there is a phrase that appears repeated in different manuscripts: the fire that consumes not, but preserves. This expression speaks not of destruction, but of something much more disquieting. It suggests a form of existence where suffering does not lead to an end, but becomes a permanent condition. Think with me. If you read the canonical text with attention, you will perceive that Jesus speaks more about hell than about heaven. This is not a coincidence. In Matthew 25:41, there is information that changes everything: the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Notice the detail. The text does not say it was created for humanity. This distinction appears in various manuscripts, but is rarely emphasized. What does this mean? That hell, according to these records, was not the original destination thought for us. It was a prison built for other creatures. But then, how did we come to be included in this reality? In the Jewish writings of the intertestamental period, especially in the preserved versions of the Book of Enoch, there are detailed descriptions regarding angels imprisoned in abysses of fire. They are not kings of these regions. They are prisoners. They await judgment in conditions that the texts describe as eternal darkness and chains of iron. Visualize the scene. Beings that one day were in the divine presence, now confined in places where there is no light, there is no hope, there's no possibility of change. These accounts reached us through copies made by communities that took these visions very seriously. So much so that many passages were memorized and recited, not merely read. But wait, if Satan and his angels are imprisoned, how to explain the traditions that place him as ruler of hell? The answer lies in the different layers of text that survived time. In the oldest records, there is a clear distinction between different states and places. Sheol, mentioned in the Old Testament, is described as a place of silence and shadow, where all the dead waited. It was more akin to a state of suspension than active punishment. Then appears Hades in the Greek text, which already brings internal differentiations. Luke 16 preserves one of the most detailed descriptions. There is a region of comfort and one of torment, separated by an impassable chasm. The tormented rich man manages to see Abraham and Lazarus on the other side, but cannot cross. Pay attention to this detail. Consciousness remains intact. Memory is not erased. The rich man remembers his previous life, recognizes Abraham, has full notion of where he is and why. This is not annihilation. It is conscious preservation in a state of suffering. Now comes the part that truly bothers. Jesus introduces a third term, Gehenna. This word appears 11 times in the Gospels, always connected to the fire that is not quenched. Matthew 10:28 preserves one of the most direct declarations. Fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna. What draws attention is that Jesus uses destroy, but the context suggests something different from complete annihilation. It is as if the word carried a sense that our current language cannot adequately capture. In marginal notes of Byzantine manuscripts, scribes left comments trying to explain this apparent contradiction. A note preserved in a codex from the 9th century says, "Destruction does not mean ceasing to exist, but losing the original form." Another scribe in a different manuscript wrote, "Like metal that melts but remains metal." These attempts at explanation show that the first generations of Christians also struggled to comprehend exactly what was being described. They had access to oral traditions that we have lost, but even so found difficulties. The Apocalypse of John introduces yet a fourth reality, the lake of fire. It is described as the final destination where death itself and Hades are cast. Revelation 20:14 preserves one of the most disturbing images. This is the second death, the lake of fire. Second death, not first. The first death would be the separation between soul and body, which we know. But what would be a second death? Preserved traditions suggest that it is the definitive separation between the creature and any possibility of divine presence. Here we arrive at what is perhaps the most frightening aspect of this entire set of texts: the idea of absolute separation from God. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 1:9 uses an expression that survived in various ancient translations: eternal separation from the presence of the Lord. But what does this mean in practice? If God is the source of everything we consider good, light, love, order, meaning, rest, beauty, hope, then the total absence of this presence would not be neutrality. It would be progressive existential collapse. In the writings of the Church Fathers, especially in those who had access to older traditions, there are descriptions that attempt to capture this reality. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, speaks of regions of outer darkness where there is no trace of the divine glory. Justin Martyr mentions places where the very concept of good becomes impossible. Try to imagine a state where you maintain full consciousness, but progressively lose any reference of what is good, beautiful, or hopeful. Where the memory of what was good becomes a source of additional torment because you know it existed, but can no longer reach it. Preserved manuscripts of the Apocalypse of Peter, which circulated widely among Christians of the first centuries, contain detailed visions of these states. Peter describes seeing people being punished according to their specific choices, but not as divine vengeance, as a natural consequence. A preserved passage says, "Those who lied habitually discover that they can no longer distinguish truth from lie, not even in their own thoughts." Another, "Those who live to humiliate others experience continuous humiliation, but without the possibility of learning compassion." Notice how these descriptions are not arbitrary. They suggest that hell would be the logical extension of choices made in life. As if destructive tendencies without the containment of divine grace simply followed their natural course to the ultimate consequences. The text continues with even more disturbing descriptions. It speaks of people who exploited the weak, discovering that all their strength has turned against themselves. Of corrupt religious leaders experiencing a spiritual thirst impossible to quench. These images were so impactful that many later leaders preferred to exclude the Apocalypse of Peter from the official canon. Not for doubting its authenticity, but for the profound psychological effect it caused in people. Now, before you think this is only about punishment, there is another aspect that complicates the question even further. In the same manuscripts, there are indications that this separation is not imposed externally. It is chosen. C.S. Lewis, upon studying these traditions, reached a disquieting conclusion. In the end, there are only two kinds of people: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says, "Thy will be done." The idea is that hell would be the eternal confirmation of a choice. The terrible possibility of someone choosing to exist without God even knowing the consequences. But why would someone make this choice? Ancient records suggest that pride can reach a point where accepting dependence on God becomes psychologically impossible, where the creature prefers destruction to submission. In Gnostic texts, there are accounts of beings who, even before the offer of restoration, choose to remain in their state of separation because acknowledging error became intolerable for them. This transforms hell from a place of punishment into a place of confirmation. Not where God sends the rejected, but where those end up who definitively reject any form of divine dependence. And here is what bothers most in the preserved records. The suggestion that this choice can be made in a manner so gradual, so subtle, that the person does not even perceive when they cross the line of irreversibility. Look at this detail that survived in marginal notes of ancient manuscripts. There are references to something called progressive hardening of the heart. The idea is that each choice against conscience makes the next similar choice easier, until the capacity for genuine repentance simply atrophies. It is not that God withdraws grace, it is that the creature develops a species of psychological immunity to it. Like someone who, by taking painkillers constantly, loses the capacity to feel both pain and relief. This would explain why Jesus spoke so much about hell. Not to frighten for pleasure, but to alert about a real danger. The possibility of, through small repeated choices, walking toward a state of separation that becomes irreversible. The preserved text suggests that this separation does not happen overnight. It is a process, and during this process, there is still possibility of change of direction. But there is a point of no return. Where is this point located? The ancient records are not clear. Some suggest it is at physical death. Others indicate it may be before, when the person becomes psychologically incapable of genuine repentance. There are still traditions that speak of a final judgment, where each person sees clearly the consequences of their choices and confirms or reverses their direction. What all records agree upon is that hell is not an accident. It is not something that happens by ignorance or by circumstance. It is the final result of a series of conscious choices made over time toward absolute independence from God. And perhaps it is exactly this that makes the concept so frightening to our modern mentality. We are accustomed to thinking of consequences as temporary, reversible, negotiable. The idea that some choices may have permanent, irreversible, definitive consequences goes against everything our culture has taught us about second chances. But the ancient text suggests that spiritual reality operates with rules different from those we know in the physical world, where time and consequence have meanings that our earthly experience cannot completely capture. This does not mean there is no mercy. On the contrary, the same texts that describe hell in detail also preserve records of an offer of salvation available until the last possible moment. The question is, what happens when someone definitively rejects this offer? The answer that emerges from the ancient manuscripts is disquieting. God respects the choice, even when the choice is for eternal separation. And this brings us to what is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire investigation. If these records preserve something close to spiritual reality, then hell is not primarily about divine punishment. It is about human choice, taken to the ultimate consequences. What makes everything even darker is the suggestion, present in various texts, that this possibility of definitive choice for separation is not a defect of the system. It is a necessary characteristic of true love, because forced love is not love, it is control. In the next minutes, we will see how these ideas developed over the centuries and what happened when certain traditions decided they were too frightening to be preserved in the original form. Because there is a whole layer of records that was deliberately softened or omitted from the most widespread versions. And when you see what was left out, you understand why some preferred to keep certain truths far from common knowledge. Resuming what we have seen so far, ancient records suggest that hell is not simply a place of punishment, but the result of choices that become irreversible. Now we need to understand why certain descriptions were deliberately removed from the best-known versions, and what these omissions reveal about the true nature of what was being described. There is a crucial difference between what was preserved in the canonical texts and what circulated in primitive Christian communities. When you compare manuscripts from different periods, it becomes clear that there was a systematic editing of certain information. Not by accident, but by conscious decisions of leaders who considered some details problematic for the general public. Let us start with what is perhaps the clearest example of this filtering: the specific descriptions of torments in the Apocalypse of Peter. This text was widely accepted and read in the churches of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So much so that some leaders considered it as authentic as the canonical Gospels, but gradually it was removed from the official lists, not for questions of authorship, but for the psychological impact it caused. The Apocalypse of Peter contains extremely detailed descriptions of specific punishments for different types of sins. Peter sees blasphemers suspended by the tongue over eternal fire, women who aborted surrounded by children who accused them constantly, men who had relations with men buried up to the neck in flaming excrement. Notice that these images are not random. Each punishment directly reflects the sin committed. The tongue that blasphemed is tormented. The womb that rejected life is confronted with eternal accusation. The body used against its natural function is degraded in the same proportion. Why were these details considered problematic? Because they suggested a level of specificity in divine justice that made hell less metaphorical and more literal than many leaders considered prudent to teach. There is a preserved letter from Serapion, Bishop of Antioch, in the beginning of the 3rd century, where he explains why he ceased to permit the public reading of the Apocalypse of Peter. He writes, "Although I recognize the authenticity of the vision, I consider that such detailed descriptions cause more terror than repentance in the majority of people." This pastoral logic led to a progressive filtering of texts that were considered excessively specific about spiritual realities. The result was that softer and more generalized versions became standard, while the original records were preserved only in monasteries and specialized libraries. But the details that were removed were not only about punishments. There were also disturbing descriptions about the nature of the condemned themselves. In preserved fragments of Gnostic writings, especially in the texts found at Nag Hammadi, there are passages that describe the process of spiritual degradation much more explicitly than anything in the canonical texts. A fragment of the Gospel of Judas contains a vision where condemned souls are shown progressively losing human characteristics. Not physically, but in terms of capacity for compassion, empathy, love, even recognition of the other as similar. The text describes, "I saw shadows that one day were men, but now were only eternal hunger turned upon itself. They could no longer recognize in others what they themselves had lost." This idea of progressive degradation of humanity itself was considered so disturbing that even Gnostic texts that circulated freely were censored on this specific point. Why? Because it suggested that condemnation was not only about suffering, but about ceasing to be human in any recognizable sense. Try to visualize what this means. A person who maintains memory and consciousness but loses the capacity to feel anything beyond their own need. Who can no longer recognize other beings as real, only as extensions of their own insatiable want. The Church Fathers, who had access to these texts, became deeply unsettled. Jerome, in a preserved letter, writes about having read descriptions that left him sleepless for weeks. He mentions texts that describe the condemned trying to communicate, but being capable only of expressing infinite variations of their own pain. Augustine, in his Confessions, makes a brief but disquieting reference to manuscripts that describe the end of human language in certain regions of darkness. He never elaborates, but the implication is that there were texts describing places where the very capacity for communication disintegrated. Imagine someone trying to speak, but managing to produce only sounds that express needs that can no longer be satisfied. Trying to communicate, but discovering that they have lost the capacity to form concepts that refer to anything beyond their own condition. These descriptions were systematically removed because they raised very complicated theological questions. If condemnation involved progressive loss of humanity itself, did this mean that at some moment the person ceased to be morally responsible for their condition? There was also the practical question. Descriptions so specific about spiritual degradation could cause despair in people who already struggled with self-destructive tendencies or depression. But there was another type of censorship, perhaps even more significant. Texts that described not only the fate of the condemned, but the effect that this fate had on other spiritual realities. In very ancient writings, there are references to what today we would call collateral damage of condemnation. The idea that the existence of beings in a state of absolute separation from God created a species of spiritual black hole that affected all creation. The Book of Enoch contains passages about this. It describes regions where the very presence of fallen angels made the space less real, where the natural order disintegrated progressively. There is a preserved passage where Enoch sees places where light itself forgets how to be light, because of the proximity to beings in a state of absolute rejection of divine reality. This suggested that hell was not a localized problem, but something that affected the stability of all creation. as if the existence of creatures in a state of total denial of reality created distortions in the very fabric of existence. These ideas were considered problematic because they implied that hell represented a cosmic danger, not just an individual one. That the condemnation of some could theoretically threaten the integrity of everything that exists. Some texts went even further, suggesting that it was exactly for this reason that there was a programmed end of times. Not only to judge the living and dead, but to contain this process of degradation before it spread beyond controllable limits. The Apocalypse of John preserves echoes of these ideas when it describes a new heaven and new earth, where the former things have passed away. The suggestion is that the current creation would be replaced, not merely renewed, to completely eliminate any trace or influence of what was corrupted beyond the possibility of restoration. But here we arrive at the most disturbing aspect of all the censored records: the descriptions of what would happen to those who chose the final separation after seeing clearly all the consequences. There are preserved fragments of text that describe a final judgment, where each person sees a complete and clear vision of both options: acceptance of divine mercy with all its implications, or definitive confirmation of the choice for absolute independence. What tormented the first Christians who had access to these texts was the suggestion that some people, even seeing clearly what they were choosing, would still opt for separation. Why? The preserved texts suggest that pride can reach a point where accepting dependence becomes literally impossible, even before the perspective of eternal suffering. A fragment of uncertain origin, preserved in a monastic library in Syria, contains this passage. I saw souls that, placed before the final choice, looked at the offered mercy and said, I prefer destruction to the humiliation of needing to be saved. This type of description was considered so disturbing that even monks who preserved controversial texts hesitated to copy it. The idea that someone could consciously choose hell, not out of ignorance or temptation, but out of pure pride, challenged all normal human understanding of rational behavior. There were also descriptions of the effect that this final choice had on those who witnessed it. Texts describe angels weeping, not from sadness, but from a type of horror that our language cannot capture. The idea was that the conscious choice for absolute evil, made with full knowledge of the consequences, represented something so contrary to the nature of reality that it caused a species of existential shock in all beings who witnessed it. As if witnessing someone deliberately choose to cease existing as a rational creature was so unnatural that it caused a reaction of cosmic repulsion. These texts were censored because they raised questions impossible to answer satisfactorily. If someone can choose absolute evil with full knowledge, does this mean that there exists something in creation that is fundamentally opposed to reality itself? There were also terrifying practical implications. If people could choose condemnation, even seeing clearly the alternatives, this suggested that no argument, however clear it, might be guaranteed conversion. That there was an element in created nature that was, by definition, unpersuadable. For Christian communities that dedicated their lives to evangelization, this idea was deeply discouraging. Therefore, texts that suggested it were gradually removed from general circulation. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all these censored records was what they implied about the nature of freedom itself. If true love demands real freedom, and real freedom includes the possibility of definitive rejection, then hell is not a defect of the divine system. It is a necessary characteristic. The preserved texts suggest that a universe where hell was impossible would be a universe where love would also be impossible, where all creatures would be essentially programmed extensions of the divine will, incapable of genuine choice. This conclusion was so disquieting that many traditions preferred to emphasize more consoling aspects of the faith, leaving these darker realities for specialized scholars. The result was a division between what was taught publicly and what was preserved in more restricted circles. A species of double tradition where truths considered too disturbing were kept alive but far from common knowledge. Today, when we have access to manuscripts that remained hidden, for centuries we can see for the first time the complete picture of what the first Christian communities really believed about these realities. And this picture is much darker, more complex, and more disturbing than any simplified version that reached us through official channels. But it is also, in a strange way, more coherent, because it explains aspects of human experience that softened versions cannot adequately address. The human capacity for self-destructive choices, the existence of people who seem incapable of genuine repentance, the intuition that certain decisions can have irreversible consequences. All these aspects of human reality make more sense when viewed in the light of these censored texts than when filtered through versions that removed the most disturbing elements. What does this leave us with? With the disquieting possibility that the most important truths about our condition may be exactly those we least want to face. And with the certainty that if these records preserve something close to reality, then our existence is much more serious, much more consequential, and much more dangerous than our modern culture allows us to imagine.